So I'm here with Tom Emanuel, or should I say Reverend Tom Emanuel. So how's it going?
I am doing well. Tonight is tonight for me.
Yep.
I know it's not for you, halfway around the world, but all's well, all's well. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, well, look, thanks for coming on. I was interested to have you on because I guess I'd seen your Twitter and like so many of these debates and discussions people have these days, sort of comes out of some kind of social media space. And I was just really interested in your engagement with Lord of the Rings, Tolkien, etc. And thought it would be interesting to have you on. And I guess on some level, this discussion is sort of motivated by recent developments in reception to the Lord of the Rings, especially, and in particular, an article that was released, I guess, a couple of months ago now, in Polygon, the queer readings article, which I think you would have seen, right? I think I saw you tweeting about that.
I was lucky enough, actually, to be one of the beta readers for that article.
Right.
Molly
Okay.
Knox Ostertag.
Yep.
It's really, really lovely.
Oh, great. Yeah. So I read that, and then, yes, I saw that you were sort of interacting with it, and I found it quite convincing and interesting. And, of course, there was a bit of a backlash to it from some quarters. And I guess I was just interested in part in talking to you about why that might be, and sort of reception to Tolkien and Lord of the Rings in general, and what you sort of think about that going forward. So I'm looking forward to that. So if anyone hasn't read that article, by the way, it's entitled "Queer Readings of the Lord of the Rings Are Not Accidents," and as Tom says, it's by Molly Ostertag, and it's on Polygon, the sort of the website. So check that out, and I'll put a link to that. And I'm also hoping to have Molly on at some stage, so we'll see how that goes. But that would be awesome as well. So check that out if you haven't. But I guess a question I start with fairly frequently when I have somebody on is how do you view the state of Tolkien studies at present? Thinking about it as a particularly scholarly area, but if you want to take that in a different direction and into sort of more general terms, that's fine too. But yeah, how do you see Tolkien studies at present?
So I come at Tolkien studies in my professional work now more as a minister in the United Church of Christ. It's a progressive denomination here in the United States.
Mm-hmm.
And so I've been out of the academy for a couple of years. And so a lot of what I think about in terms of Tolkien and Tolkien studies is reception, is how does our reading of the text change, and how is particularly in terms of the different lenses of scholarship we're bringing to it. Tolkien studies has historically been described, even by its proponents, as it's a little siloed. Sometimes we focus a little too intensely on Tolkien alone, or don't read him in conversation with wider literary currents or wider social and analytical and et cetera currents. And one of the things that I'm loving about Tolkien studies now, and about Tolkien discourse in general, is the way that we are seeing more and more diverse voices coming to the table, more diverse ways of reading the text, not just from a critical perspective, although as with any great work of art, there's plenty to critique, but it's loving critique. It's people who have loved these books, who are encountering them anew through the lenses of gender and race and post-colonial studies. And not to say that these things haven't been going on in the field for a while, but I feel like at this particular moment we are seeing how academic discourses in Tolkien studies are now trickling down, or not even trickling down, but are now more widely available to fans, more widely available to people who may not necessarily be literary academics. I think the article by Molly Ostertag is a perfect example of, that's in Polygon. That's in what is fundamentally a video game website, right? But it's introducing people to these ideas who haven't necessarily been involved in these conversations at, say, the Tolkien Society or the various the literary journals
Mm.
are having, and I'm really enjoying that. I mean, on Twitter, one of the reasons I joined Twitter in the first place is to go find other Tolkien fans, and the quality of conversations and the diversity of interpretations you find, I think, is just so exciting.
Absolutely, yeah. No, I I tend to agree. And as we've already mentioned, that article is a great example of this trend. I guess I'm just fascinated by the whole discourse that this article produced, and not only that, but I don't know if you saw on various Tolkien Reddits recently. um, there was discussion over this new book, The Nature of Middle Earth, which has been released only actually a few days ago now.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not sure if you've had a chance to look at that yet, but there are some notions there about sort of elvish relationships, right? So primarily, this is relating back to the Silmarillion material,
Right.
but and there's one footnote in the book, particularly, which is not is not directly suggesting same-sex relationships, but it perhaps opens the door to that. And there was a discussion going on, as to whether that involved, just feelings of love or sex or whatever. And indeed, on a couple of the Reddit threads, the author or the editor, Carl
Yes.
Hostetter of the book, got involved in the discussion, very much against that position. So, even people who are very much involved in the sort of publication of Tolkien's work, are very interested, obviously, in shaping the discourse and shaping the way we receive Tolkien. So, although I'm very sympathetic and find much to agree with in this particular, shall we say, I guess, queer reading, especially with regard to Frodo and Sam, as we'll come to. Um, I'm fascinated by this blowback. So, what do you think about how, especially when editors are getting involved in the discussion directly on Reddit threads, right? And saying, no, you're wrong. This is not what Tolkien meant. This is not what I meant, etc. How should we take that? How should we interact with that going forward, as readers suggesting perhaps new and or at least, readings that are now more widely available to more people?
I come at this particularly from the perspective of somebody who spends a lot of time with texts
Mm.
that people have a habit of interpreting in some wildly different ways for some very different theological and political and spiritual purposes.
Mm.
And so I have always taken an approach to the Jewish and Christian scriptures. I draw from the Jewish tradition of interpretation, which there's a saying that Torah has 70 faces.
Mm-hmm.
And what the rabbis mean by that is that this beautiful book that is of so important and of such deep value and meaning to so many people, every line of it, every story has multiple interpretations. Not only can you interpret it in multiple ways, but in fact, until you have done so, until you have allowed multiple voices to speak within the text itself, you have not fully understood it. If you attempt to limit it to a single fixed meaning that is fixed in time, in space, in context, then you're not understanding what the purpose of Torah, or I would say more broadly, the Bible, is. And that's the hermeneutic. That's the way that I tend to read Tolkien. Very much the same, is that we are looking at a text that, if it's not religious, it's certainly of semi-religious. I mean, for a lot of people, this is one of our foundational texts. I mean, certainly for me, it's. I sometimes joke that I went to graduate school for theological studies, and I still know more about Middle Earth than I do about ancient Israel. And that's 100% true, because this book is so important to me and to so many people. And it inspires that kind of zealousness from wherever your interpretive perspective is. And so my take on Tolkien and in literature in general, but particularly literature like this that has such a devout, meant in the various sense of the word, fandom, is that whether, first of all, we can't exactly be sure what Tolkien meant any more than we can be sure what the authors of biblical texts meant. What we have is the text, and with Tolkien, of course, it's more modern, so we have interviews and we have letters and that sort of thing. So we have a little bit more of a, the mind behind the material. And that, I don't think that is limiting to the interpretations we can make, the meaning we can find. I don't think Tolkien would have wanted us to simply limit our interpretations to some sort of fixed intent that he had. And what would Tolkien have thought of these interpretations? I don't know. He died in 1973. He was born in the late 1800s. Like, I don't know what Tolkien would think about Twitter, let alone anybody having debates about his work on it, right? So I think it's, I think it's rather silly to try to, well, it's not really rather silly, it's understandable, but I certainly wouldn't come down in favor of saying, oh, well, Tolkien must have meant this, or for that matter, the editor must have meant this, and therefore we cannot have this breadth of experience and these ways for people to find themselves in these texts. Because I don't think that's how, I mean, certainly not how the Bible works, and I don't think that's how the really great stories, the ones that really mattered, Mr. Frodo, I don't think that's how they work.
For sure. Yeah, and it'll be interesting to see going forward with this new book, how that's integrated into discussions about this question of queer readings, because it seems like there's quite a bit of material in there that people are talking about. Have you had a chance to look at that yet, or not? Not really.
I've seen some excerpts of the nature of Middle Earth, and particularly some of those relating to questions of gender and sexuality and the kinds of relationships in question.
Yeah.
And I mean, my take on them is simply that gender and sexuality and love, considered broadly, not just as romantic love, but love in Middle Earth is more expansive than I think a lot of our modern definitions of it. And I think that's, I'm rereading the Silmarillion for the first time since graduate school, and I'm struck again by the language around the Valar and the Maiar, and how they take on the forms of male and female, of masculine and feminine, but that's not because they are those things in any fixed sense. It is because they're ways of communicating their essential isness, their being, right? It's more, it's a performance. It's a performance of a particular kind of energy in the world, rather than it is Manwë is a man and Yavanna is a woman. That's not what we're talking about here. And I love that. Like, every time I reread Tolkien, I'm struck anew by these little almost asides that are like, oh, but there's an opening there for so much. Yeah.
Yeah. No, absolutely. Yep. No, that makes sense. I did a bit of a reread of the Silmarillion myself, fairly recently, and and it is a capacious text. How are you enjoying your experience more generally with the book?
The stories of Middle Earth, whenever I return to them, reveal something new and powerful to me. This time, I'm particularly struck by the letter to a potential publisher of Lord of the Rings at the front. It's the preface of the text, and just Tolkien's exploration or explication of his theology of creativity just grabbed me by the throat this time. It's so beautiful, to understand so much of Middle Earth as this meditation, and the history of Arda as this meditation on the human and the elvish, obviously, but generally the capacity of creatures to create. We make still by the law in which we're made, as Tolkien says in Utopia, and that sense of even Melkor, even Sauron, even the evil characters and are in their origins good. And there is something so glorious about this story that's really about fundamentally about creativity, I think. In some important ways, and I hadn't caught that flavor in it the last time I was with this material, but this time it's so clear, right? Right from the beginning, music of the Ainur, the whole, it gives me the shivers. I love it.
Fantastic. I'll be interested to see, how you take how you feel about the final few chapters. That'll be fantastic. But yes, the Silmarillion is I think. I don't know if I like it more than the Lord of the Rings, but it's certainly I think equal in my judgment in some regards. At any rate, although obviously presented in quite a different way. But I guess we can get into the main topic for today, which is really, as we've mentioned, sort of queer readings, feminist readings, etc. We've talked a little bit about Molly Ostertag's article and sort of the backlash, and also this urge on the part of readers to want to really center their own interpretive, I guess, frameworks, as we all do to an extent. But obviously this particular argument has motivated a lot of discussion, and in the article. Molly's Ostertag's article, and we won't go too much into detail because, as I said, I might try and talk with Molly a little bit more about the article in particular. But an argument is made, essentially that the relationship between Frodo and Sam can be understood within the text itself as, as again more capaciously, let's say, than a friendship, and that there are undertones there that people have reported and have noted throughout the years that are not that are deliberate, perhaps might we say. So I don't know. I guess, how do you respond to that article, and is that something in your reading that has always been, say, obvious to you, or at least something that struck you as plausible, I guess?
It's quite funny to me because until actually I began to interact with Molly Ostertag on Twitter and other fans, I'd never really participated in Tolkien fandom in that way. I'd been very much on the scholarly end of things and reading the scholarship and sort of interacting with folks who were digging deep into the texts in that way, but I hadn't really done a lot of Tolkien fandom, weirdly enough. And to find it online and to find people who are reading these characters as openly, just deliberately, they're saying my reading of these characters is as queer, right? And it initially I bristled against that, not because I'm bisexual, my partner's gender expansive, some of the most important people in my life are transgender, down the list. I'm not because I find it offensive, the idea that Sam and Frodo are gay or whatever you want to call it, queer, right? But because for me, I'd historically written it as, oh my God, look at masculinity in Tolkien, right? Like, look at how these characters are able to be so tender and loving toward one another, and it doesn't have to be a romantic relationship. And so it took a minute for me to actually kind of wrap my head around the idea that, but that you could absolutely read it as being romantic if you wanted to, right? And that the text actually actively supports that in the kind of language that Tolkien uses in the, particularly in moments, for instance, where Sam defends Frodo against Shelob, and Tolkien compares it to an animal protecting its mate against a predator, and the unpublished epilogue where Sam's daughter Eleanor draws the contrast, or not the contrast, but the comparison between Frodo and Sam and Galadriel and Celeborn, right? And I just reread The Lord of the Rings aloud to my infant son recently, finished about a month ago, which was, oh my God. Talk about the waterworks, my God.
Yes, I sort of followed that on Twitter, yeah.
I live tweeted my experience. But this time, having been introduced to that interpretive framework, having been introduced to the idea of these characters as queer, like it just jumped off the page at me. As of course, you don't even have to work at it. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
Like once I could see it, it's like one of those magic eye posters, right? Like you don't see it until you do. Do you know what I'm talking about? The ones that you had to stare at and they kind of pop. Yeah, okay. So never sure who knows my references. But once you realize it's there, it's like, oh, of course, it was there the whole time and I didn't see it. And do you have to read it that way? Not if you don't want to. You don't. You can read it as a very tender heterosexual or platonic relationship, I should say. But you can also read it as this very beautiful queer romance story. And I think that there are shades of meaning and loveliness that come out in the text in a way that I hadn't noticed them before because I'm now reading it this way, or I'm reading it open to this interpretation. I think it's beautiful in a way that I may not have noticed before.
Yeah, for sure. I think I noticed myself on my own recent reread. I sort of spent the first half of this year reading it. So I guess that was kind of before the article came out. It was in June, but still, I think I was perhaps primed, more, or at least more primed, to see something like that. And I think the parts of the book that have become my favorite now are, those chapters in book, book 4, when they're trudging to Mordor, and then sort of book 6 when they sort of actually get there. And the sort of the dynamic between Frodo, Sam, and Gollum. It's so well done, actually, and quite tender. And I tend to think the films butchered that a bit. But anyway, that's another discussion.
Oh, you don't want to get me started.
Are you? Well, okay. Well, let's go down that rabbit hole just for 5 minutes. Are you a Jackson fan in general, or not really? Out of interest.
I'm rather insufferable to watch the films with because I seesaw back and forth between just tears of joy at how beautifully he captures scenes and moments and characterizations and the music and just the swelling grandeur of it all. And then 5 minutes later, I'm raging at the screen about how Peter Jackson fundamentally misunderstands Tolkien's moral universe. I don't recommend watching it.
No, fair enough. Trip. I feel like yeah. I feel like I have a similar reaction every time. I actually did a rewatch recently, and I think I was quite insufferable to my housemate. But anyway, it was fun to revisit them, I guess, after a few years.
And one of the things I realized about that, just to entertain the tangent for a moment, is I read The Lord of the Rings in 2001, before the films came out, before I even knew there were films going to come out. It's been I had my own ideas about what the text was and what the story was, even before I saw Peter Jackson's films. And I was only 11 at the time, but I have never encountered the films on their own terms. I've never been able to encounter them as anything but an adaptation of the books. And so I don't actually understand what it means to be somebody for whom the films were their introduction to Middle Earth. And I wonder how much of my insufferability watching them stems from that fact, is the fact that I'm not encountering this the way that many people of my generation and others, for that matter, younger generations, did, which is this is the story that they met first. And I have no way of taking off putting on blinders and not being able to see it as a brilliant but imperfect, at times frustratingly imperfect adaptation of Tolkien's text. So I'm hoping that as I get older, I can be more generous to Peter Jackson's interpretation. But don't talk to me about Faramir. Just never talk to me about Faramir.
Oh gosh, yeah. I mean, it sounds like we're the same age then, because I was about 11 when Fellowship came out, or 10. But I definitely saw that film in the cinemas. I have a very distinct memory of that before I'd read any of the books. But then I think I read the books before The Two Towers came out, so I was sort of in the middle. But I think I have the same reaction. I sort of the books are definitely the central the central pillar for me. The films are sort of very secondary
Sure.
as interpretations of the work. But yeah, anyway, bit of a film tangent. I guess it's hard to avoid Jackson, really.
True.
But yeah, I guess getting back to the discussion, I guess the question of Frodo and Sam in the Lord of the Rings, especially the books, of course, brings up the question, and I think you mentioned it before, sort of masculinity in general. There have been some essays, or at least some arguments made recently that, in a more general sense, there's something I don't know, that there's something positive or efficacious about masculinity in the Lord of the Rings generally. I think it'll be interesting to see with your reading the Silmarillion now what you think of that, because there's quite a few characters who are not quite as likable, shall we say, as Aragorn or the book Faramir. But how do you think about masculinity in general in the Lord of the Rings? And I want to also bring in the question here of the critique that I see less of these days, but used to be a major critique. Maybe it still is in some parts, that the Lord of the Rings is somehow a lesser book because there were fewer women characters in it. I feel like, as I've put in my notes, I feel maybe people have moved on from that debate. I feel like that sort of that score keeping kind of approach is less popular now. But I don't know. How do you think about that? I guess there's two questions in there, but I'll let you riff on it.
Sure. As to masculinity, I mean, I think that Frodo and Sam are sort of a test case of that. As I said earlier, whether you read that as a love story in a romantic sense or a love story in a platonic sense, because it's a love story whether you like it or not, whether you impute romantic qualities to that is up to the reader. But they're iconic of the Lord of the Rings, and I think Tolkien's work in general, insofar as their masculinity is it's positive masculinity as a contrast to toxic masculinity, right? Like it's extremely positive. They love one another. They express their love for one another. They are physically affectionate. They and particularly, I think heroism in Tolkien is not. Certainly in the Lord of the Rings anyway, is not constructed around these kind of classical, ultra macho, heroic tropes. There's, I think, a lot of copycat fantasy really misunderstood Tolkien when they made their heroes the Aragorns of the world instead of the Frodos of the world. Not that to say that Aragorn is he's actually a very positive masculine presence. It's a masculinity that is predicated on defense of others, on honor, on commitment, on friendship. The way he interacts with Boromir, the way he interacts with Éomer, the other kind of big dude bros, if you will, of the narrative is one of blood brothers. It's one of deep respect for one another as people and care for one another as fellow warriors and as fellow men. But I think that much fantasy went in the direction of, the Aragorn, the king, the warrior, the lord is the interesting character, and Tolkien is pretty consistent in subverting that in his text. Not particularly in The Lord of the Rings, which might be one of the reasons it's my favorite of his texts. But even the examples of things like Beren and Luthien. Beren is definitely not wearing the pants in that relationship, if you'll forgive a rather sexist metaphor. But the idea that this banned and outlawed man and his partner, the sort of just a maiden, that they're the ones who are going to bring down, going to be able to get their hands on a Silmaril, not the armies of the Noldor, not the armies of men, but these two people who are in love, acting out of love for one another and a commitment to one another and to goodness, that is actually going to be the thing that wins the day. And that, of course, is a very direct and obvious parallel, and I would call it an explicit parallel to Frodo and Sam in The Lord of the Rings. But there is this sense that in Tolkien that the traditional masculine virtues, I shouldn't say the traditional masculine virtues, the What are seen in certain quarters as the masculine virtues of things like strength and
Sure.
warrior culture and honor in a really kind of
Yeah, macho kind
over
of.
the top sense.
Yeah.
That's machismo, right?
Mm.
That's not the character. That's not the heroism and the masculinity that Tolkien presents. And to the extent that it appears in characters, I think you'd mentioned like Turin, Turambar, or in Feanor,
Yeah.
it is they are not coded as role models. Right?
Mm.
I don't see them framed as role models. I see them framed as these very powerful and interesting and conflicted figures, but they're not the kind of clear, virtuous role model that, say, Aragorn or Faramir is.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting to talk about Turin. That's my favorite story in Tolkien, actually, my favorite book. And yeah, I think because his character is explicitly said to, to have a very caring nature and side, so shall we say, and yet obviously, for those who know the story, things don't exactly work out. So I think it's interesting. I mean, that would be a whole essay, perhaps, for someone to write. But yeah, the sort of internal conflict in Turin, for example, between his what we might say healthy masculinity and his machismo or aggression is a central part of that story, and quite interesting. Whereas a figure like Aragorn seems to have shorn himself of all those sort of internal problems by the time we meet him in the Lord of the Rings, if indeed he ever had those sort of violent and impulsive character traits. I doubt it in Aragorn's case, but but yeah, Turin is an interesting and instructive contrast, and Feanor, of course, is just his own thing, I think.
Correct.
Yeah, so no, that's interesting, and yeah, I guess I'd just be interested to hear what you think about the other part of that question, or the other part of the ramblings that I gave before. Is it a I don't know, women in Tolkien? This question, especially the Lord of the Rings, is that something that is still a question for critical discussion? I mean, obviously, it still is, and it probably will be for a while. But is that critique that the Lord of the Rings is a lesser work because, well, it doesn't have so many female characters? Is that something that you still hear a lot, or should or of these new perhaps discourses sort of supplanted some of that old discourse, I guess, around femininity, women in Tolkien, and things like that?
My observation is more toward the latter, that certainly, of course, there are, by the sheer numbers, fewer women characters in Tolkien than there are male characters, and particularly in The Lord of the Rings.
Mm-hmm.
And that is, there's a kind of, early 2010s sort of not particularly creative feminist read of that, right? And it's kind of like, well, there are no women in it, therefore that means that the text is necessarily patriarchal. And I think that, hey, fair enough, there aren't a lot of women in this text. It would be that's a fair critique. I don't think there's any dancing around that. I think it's worth looking at, of course, and maybe as a white guy in a straight passing relationship, maybe this is not entirely my lane. But I've heard from a number of feminist scholars and just, women and otherly gendered readers of Lord of the Rings and of Tolkien in general, that if you look into the characters themselves, so Éowyn or Galadriel, particularly in Lord of the Rings, that you find it's not as simple as the men do all the work and have all the battle glory and the women stand on the sidelines. I mean, Éowyn is obviously a counterexample to that. But in this last reread, I was struck by her very, very feminist rebuke to Aragorn, who's like, you need to stay here, you need to take care of your people. And she says, that is simply to say that you may remain in the house because the men no longer have need of it. And in the final hour, you may be burned in it. And it's like,
yeah.
whoa, like that, it's right on the money. Like he's doing his best to be kind and to get her to fulfill her duty to her people, or to encourage her to fulfill her duty to her people, but she nails it. She nails that kind of the what might even be said patronizing or paternalistic
Yeah.
languaging toward her, and I think it's great in that even Aragorn can come off as condescending, right? And that she really, and so I love that, right? And I think that Galadriel as a character is much more nuanced than simply playing the sort of chaste virgin mother goddess energy. She is obvious. I mean, especially if you read the Silmarillion and the related materials, she's obviously got a lot going on. But just the power she embodies, and the sense of the idea Tolkien writes somewhere or another that none at the end of the Third Age, none could have conquered Lothlorien but Sauron himself, because Galadriel held that much power in the land and was then able to embody that much goodness and that much virtue and that much energy there. And we see that, of course, in her interaction with Frodo in the Fellowship of the Ring. And but just the sense that femininity in Tolkien is more nuanced and more complicated than it would appear from simply taking a head count of women characters in the books.
Yep.
And hey, fair enough. Absolutely fair enough that there aren't a lot of guys being mentioned. There aren't a lot of guys mentioned, or women mentioned in the New Testament either, unfortunately. They are there. And if you look at them, particularly people like Mary Magdalene or Mary, the mother of Jesus, they're much more complicated and interesting than you might guess based on some particularly patriarchal Christians' reading of them. But what can I say? There are two books I know really well.
No, that's fair. Yep. Yeah, no, that's great. Have you ever? Well, yeah, I'm not sure if you've had a chance to read Eldarion and Arendis from Unfinished Tales.
It has been a while, but I'm familiar with it. I don't remember the outlines of the story very well, but I mean, it's been a good 15 years. But
right, yeah, no, fair enough. Yeah, Arendis is a very interesting character in that regard. If you ever get to that book again, just FYI. So yeah, I guess. I guess we can move on from that general discussion, but just to to tie a bow on that, I guess it's interesting, and it will be interesting going forward to see how Tolkien fandom and Tolkien studies in general, I guess, reacts to, engages with, new voices. And gosh, I follow so many new people on Twitter who are doing PhDs, or they're, just writing about Tolkien or tweeting about Tolkien or doing Tolkien art or something like that. And it's just really good to see. My feeling is that there's a sort of efflorescence of the fandom. Maybe it's motivated in part by the Amazon show, although my impression is that that's not really the case. I think my impression is that it's motivated just by people discovering the books and reading the books and perhaps the movies. But it's really good to see. So as this Amazon show comes out, it'll be, be fascinating to see what they do with some of that material. And
it was my observation, at least in the corner of the Tolkien fandom that I occupy, that the first stills from the Amazon show came out and everybody was very excited. And then we got our first excerpts from The Nature of Middle-earth, and everybody was gaga for the suggestion that there's gender expansiveness in elves. And granted, I occupy a particular corner of the Tolkien fandom on Twitter, so that may not be entirely generalizable, but I agree with you. Like, it's this interesting thing of people seem to be coming to the text and the stories and the movies, and it doesn't seem to be motivated, at least in my observation, by the fact of this gigantic series being in the works. It seems that people, maybe it's just because things run in a 20-year cycle and we're all remembering where we were and how we were when we first saw the Fellowship of the Ring 20 years ago. Maybe there's something in this, like the natural nostalgia cycle like that. But I do notice that even I got my copy of the Bulletin of the Tolkien Society, Amon Hen, this last week, and and their use of diverse diverse representation of figures from Middle Earth is so. I just think it's beautiful. I think it's beautiful that we are able, because of in many ways, because of the internet and because of the quality of the discourse, to be able to reimagine Middle Earth in this new light. It's really, I find it terribly exciting.
Yeah, absolutely. I guess it just, for me, brings to mind, a question that I've been thinking about recently, which is that, I don't know, I listened to another Tolkien podcast. I won't name names, but, well, I listened to a few, but it's particularly religious, I guess, of a certain more conservative bent, shall we say? And a lot of the podcast is interesting, and it's good, and the guests are very insightful. But there's a clear sense when listening to this podcast, for example, just to take an example, that that these sort of readings will not be welcome, and that they're not going to be interviewing Molly or anyone associated, shall we say, with that side of fandom, whether you call that the mainstream side or not. And I don't know, I just I sort of thought, okay, although there's a bit of an efflorescence here, I'm also seeing a siloing of, perhaps it's just reflective culture in general now, but a siloing of the fandom into different camps. Maybe this was always the case, I don't know, but I sort of wrote on my Twitter the other day, on the podcast Twitter, that I want to, on this podcast, I want to be able to. It's kind of set up as a secular space, for readers of any kind, and I'm sort of keen to interview different people and talk to different kinds of fans, but yeah, that's the goal. But whether or not that comes to fruition or not, but I don't know if you've noticed anything like that as well. And my feeling is it's going to be important to reach out and talk to, people of different persuasions. Not always, not to agree with them and to sort of mollycoddle, but to, to have a dialogue, sometimes critical in nature, perhaps. But I don't know how you would think about that. But yeah, my impression is with a lot of this, I guess it's just, again, the culture war stuff in general, but there is a bit of siloing going on that I find, is sad, because is this not something that should, in theory, bring us all together, at least to some extent? I don't know. Or is that sort of utopian and silly and naive?
Well, I've actually been working on an article on exactly that.
Right.
Out in about a little less than a week here, actually.
Oh, okay.
So I won't give too much of that away, but I do think that there's this very interesting thing that the Lord of the Rings and Tolkien in general is, and has, since its publication, been received positively, enthusiastically by people of all, a lot of different political and theological and aesthetic and literary persuasions. It's quite remarkable just how broad the fandom is for this text, just how broad the level of engagement is, and the extent to which one can work out a relatively coherent ideological or theological reading of it. From a variety of perspectives. So I, as a progressive Christian, a socialist, a feminist, a queer theorist, I can go to the Lord of the Rings and I find in the text support for for ecology, for an ecological view of the world. I see a critique of industrialization and a critique of domination of all kinds. I find positive masculinity, and I find queer subtexts, or sometimes just texts. And I find, something I've noticed recently is, in talking about Númenórean settlement in Middle Earth during the Second Age, Tolkien points out that it was after their decline, so it was as they were falling away toward evil, that they actually started to colonize Middle Earth and started extracting tribute from Harad and from the east. And I think that's really interesting, because if you want to do a sort of surface level rating of Númenóreans in Middle Earth, well, you could say that it's Westerners coming into the east and colonizing it because they're better than everybody else, right? That is I don't think that's a particularly nuanced read, but it is there in the text if that's what you want to do with it, right? Which is, again, this is exactly how people tend to treat the Bible. If you go into the text looking for what you already believe, and then you find justification for it.
Sure. Yeah.
Often is often the case. But I simply point this out to say that what that speaks to me of is the enduring power of the work that we can come to it that a very conservative Catholic and an evangelical Protestant and somebody of no faith whatsoever and somebody of a Muslim or a Buddhist or what have you, that all of which I'm familiar with, people from different faith traditions or from no faith tradition, people who are staunch conservatives or moderate liberals or outright socialist liberationists, that we can all come to this text and find meaning and value in it in a way that I haven't seen that with many texts other than the Bible, to be honest with you. I'm sure there are others, but it just astonishes me and it consistently delights me. Well, it does delight me. It also, I think you're absolutely right about the siloing effect, because I think there are some really great, the thing about a lot of conservative Christians is that I will follow them. Absolutely. I think there's a really good analysis. They're really putting their finger on something important about spirituality and about the way we live in the world, the way we define our identities in relationship to our communities and to our God. And then you talk about not letting women talk in church, and it's like, come on, man.
Yeah.
I was with you 98% of the way.
Yeah, for sure.
I was with you until you became an apologist for American Empire. Like, come on.
That's how I feel about this. Well, that one particular podcast. But anyway, yeah.
But the fact that, looking back at the way that evangelicals, for instance, encountered Lord of the Rings when the films came out in the early 2000s, they held them up as good fantasy and sort of this icon of good values like loyalty and honesty and self-sacrifice and humility. And they are, correct. That is absolutely true. Those are values that are consistent with the stated values, at least, of many conservative Christian groups. And again, note stated. I'm not saying that I'm necessarily better at following them. I'm just saying sometimes there's a mismatch between what we say we believe and what we do.
Yeah, for sure. Yep.
But that those values like that are universal, or if not universal, at least widely applicable in human experience. And I think that's a testament to what Tolkien succeeded in.
Yep. Yeah. No, for sure. That's good. So, yeah. No, it'll be interesting to see. Going forward, how the fandom expands, and which no doubt it will in coming years because of the show. But also, how different elements of the fandom, I guess, interact. That's, I don't know, something that increasingly just interests me. But I guess to sort of close out, I've mentioned before that, or you've mentioned rather, that that you were sort of live blogging or live tweeting, I should say. Your reread of the book sort of recently, and I was following a lot of that with interest, and I'm just interested for you personally. Where does that deep admiration for the book, for the Lord of the Rings, stem from? Because I feel sort of, an affinity with those reactions, and it's definitely the same for me. So I'd just be interested in your response to that.
So Middle Earth
Where to begin?
has been in. Yeah, that's a just big sigh. Middle Earth has been in my blood since, in my bones since the day I was born. My father read me The Hobbit aloud when I was too young to remember it. I can't remember a world in which I didn't know the words to all the songs in the 1977 Rankin Bass animated Hobbit.
Right.
Can't remember that world. It's lodged in there. And I didn't read The Lord of the Rings until I was older, until I was 11, because I didn't have the reading comprehension to do it yet.
Sure.
But as soon as I found it. I find it difficult to articulate how much these books mean to me. And I think part of that lies in the way they bridge grief
Mm.
and joy.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
There's something about these texts that, about this story of the world kind of sucks. There's a lot of evil in it. There's a lot of, it's not the way it should be, or it's not the way it could be. Much that we love is passing away before our eyes, and our efforts to change the world seem, on their face, foolhardy. A fool's hope,
Yeah.
as Gandalf says,
Yeah.
at some point or another, and that, just that deep and abiding sense. Number one, that not the confrontation, the awareness, the reality of the grief of being human and being in the world, and the commitment to go on, to friendship, to community, to beauty, to love, to the light that shines, and the shadow is only a small and passing thing, and there's light and high beauty forever beyond its reach. My favorite passage in the Lord of the Rings: Sam looks up, sees Eärendil in Mordor. That's it to me. It's something I can't put words to, but it inspires the way that I live. It inspires my work as a minister. I can't tell you how much it meant to share that aloud with my son, to have the first book he ever heard in this world be The Lord of the Rings.
That's beautiful.
And the day he was born, I read the opening paragraph of an unexpected party, or a long expected party to him, and that it's the bedrock of my sense of story. It's the bedrock of my sense of what story can do for us and to us. And I don't have any. I feel words fall really short of it. Words really fall short of it, but I love it so much.
Yeah, that's beautiful. I'm just curious, was there a conscious choice around starting with Fellowship as opposed to The Hobbit, or is that something that might come later as well? Or, I mean, in terms of reading to your son?
It's honestly because we were. I had just finished reading The Hobbit to the kid's mom.
Right.
So I'd been reading it aloud. That was something we do as a couple. We read aloud books to one another. So I just finished The Hobbit, and then my son Ari came into the world, and hey, it was the right time to drop in the Lord of the Rings.
Right. No, that makes sense. Yeah. No, that's cool. Yeah. I was just curious about that. Yeah, I think that's beautiful, and I'm curious about, on my own recent reread. As I mentioned, I sort of went back to it the first half of the year. I was struck by, I mean, that passage you mentioned is beautiful, where Sam sees the star. But I was also struck by Frodo as a character who often is overlooked in favor of Sam. He often feels like a bit of a blank slate, perhaps, in people's minds. But what do you think of Frodo as a character? I sort of, every time I read the book, I grow to appreciate Frodo a little bit more. Maybe as I'm getting older, I'm getting more sort of, I don't know if Frodo's he's not cynical exactly, but his heart's sort of not in it in the same way that Sam's is. I'm not quite sure how to put it, but I don't know if you would, if you had any reflections on Frodo as a character from your recent read through, but it's just something I was thinking about.
My take on Frodo is that he's very tired and very sad.
Yeah, for sure.
And I don't mean those as like he's just a sad boy. He's just he's just mopey. I don't read him that way, but that he, perhaps uniquely among hobbits, or certainly sort of understands the grief of the elves.
Yes.
He understands the loss. He lost his parents young, and then he loses his gay uncle, if you will, at his birthday party, and his father surrogate, his parental surrogate, and then is tasked with this truly impossible thing that ultimately nobody in Middle Earth could have probably withstood the lure of the ring at the end, right? And so Frodo goes through this experience. It's deeply traumatizing, having had a bit of a tragic backstory of his own, which you don't think about. It kind of passes in the first couple of chapters, but the idea that Frodo has this identification or this understanding of the grief at the heart of the elves leaving Middle Earth, and then that continues. To my inner image of Frodo is often with a sad kind of smile on his face, and that becomes more and more just dogged and beaten down the further along he gets and the heavier the ring gets. And that's what distinguishes him from Sam, I think, is that he's just put your head down, move forward, keep moving forward to the best of your ability. And when you can't move forward anymore, well, then God Sam's there to keep you moving.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think it's a quieter character. He doesn't have the kind of Labrador retriever, like loyalty and faithfulness and energy that Sam does, who is, by the way, probably my favorite character in all of fiction, Sam Gamgee.
Right, yeah. Yeah.
But Frodo, I think, is really compelling, if but quieter and more sad.
Yeah, well, that's definitely. I definitely see that, especially towards the end of the book. I guess just a question to finish on with regards to the Lord of the Rings book itself. Then is, another question I've been thinking about recently, in light of a lot of discussion about the ending of the Lord of the Rings, which of course people talk about a lot, at least in my experience. Is it a tragedy or is it a tragicomedy? How do you sort of how do you take the end of the book? Is it a happy ending?
That is such a hard question to answer.
Yeah, sorry to spring that on you.
I believe that it is. I mean, tragicomedy gets closer to it. I'd call it a bittersweet ending.
Sure.
More than happy or sad. Our protagonist is too traumatized to remain in the world, to remain in the land that his actions saved, the land that he went on the quest for in the first place. And yes, the king returns, and it's a beautiful summer, and Sam has too many children to count, and Sauron is overthrown, and it all turns out, at least on the surface, very well. It's a happy ending in the sense that our heroes survive and the evil is defeated, but the elves are leaving. Frodo leaves. The Ents are dwindling. The dwarves are dwindling. There's this very real sense that we are passing out of this world of magic and mystery and high beauty into the world of men and women and humans. I think I could go on. I will simply close that. I think it's very good that Tolkien decided to cut the unpublished epilogue. I think The Lord of the Rings ends perfectly where it does. Yeah. And I am very good that the unpublished epilogue exists, because the conversation between Sam and Eleanor about what is our responsibility as those who now live in this quote unquote happy ending. Well, our responsibility is to carry on the memory of what came before us, and to remind people that there was high beauty, and there was great drama, and there was great evil, and that we are the inheritors of that past, even if we aren't living in that same world.
I've never actually read that epilogue, or the proposed epilogue. I should pick up. I guess it's in the History of Middle Earth somewhere.
It's in Sauron Defeated, but right. I can also there's a PDF of it out there that I can send you.
Oh, okay, that might be good. Yeah, fantastic. I'll definitely have to look at that, because I've seen it. Obviously, I've seen it referenced, but yeah, I've just never got around to actually acquiring it. I think I have a few History of Middle Earth books, but not that one. Well, I guess we can sort of close out. It's been a lovely conversation. Lovely to have you on the podcast. So, you've mentioned that you're sort of working on a paper or an article. how do you see the future for you and Tolkien? You mentioned that, and this is something else that I've sort of seen you or followed on Twitter, as it were. You mentioned Tolkien a lot in the ministry, in your ministry, which I think is great. I'm guessing that will continue, but what else is on the cards, as it were?
So my Twitter handle is at real Tom Emanuel,
Mm-hmm.
and you can follow me there for all of my silly and not so silly takes about Lord of the Rings and get information about how much I love my infant child. And I will have an article or an essay out
Mm-hmm.
later this week. So if you check my Twitter, you'll find it there. Don't want to give things away quite yet.
Nope, I look forward to that. Yeah.
But also, I continue to use Tolkien. I mean, if it weren't clear, the stories undergird my sense of what stories are and how we use them and how we make meaning with them. So in some sense, I'm always using the Lord of the Rings in my ministry.
Yep.
I am in preliminary stages of working on a course, a church course, well, specifically for church people, but open to anyone really, the Gospel According to Tolkien.
Oh, nice. Yep.
Which I hope to offer either at the end of this year or sometime early next in 2022. And I am on the ground level of putting together some kind of YouTube content around Tolkien and thinking about the stories. And so if you like what I had to say, you can keep your eye on my Twitter account, because that's where I post updates for all these things.
Oh, fantastic. Thank you. Oh, well, I look forward to the YouTube. The Tolkien YouTube community is growing a lot as well. I do post the podcast there, but I don't really do anything with it, so perhaps I should think about that myself. But look, thank you so much for coming on. It's been really lovely to have you on as a guest and to discuss your perspective. So we'll look forward to all of that material and look forward to reading this essay coming out soon, considering what we've discussed. So that'll be fascinating. So thanks again, and all the best.
Hey, thanks for having me on, Ben. It's been a pleasure.
No worries.
Peace.